Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all. It's such a pleasure to welcome you again to our True Africa University MIT Africa webinar series. The series has been about sustainable development in Africa, and this is our 7th week. We started on March 4th with a screening of the film The Great Green Wall, and we've been talking with various experts across various industries and academia, and the cultural industries in Africa and the African diaspora. And it's been a wonderful journey so far. We have 4 more weeks left in this journey. And this week, we have a really interesting panel discussion around basically myself, Leonard Wantchekon, the professor of politics and international affairs in Princeton University, and the other panelists will be the participants, because we always get so many really super interesting questions. And the topic is really about this new solutions for education and improved governance, but the real focus will be on the type of leadership that we believe Africa might need in this new century in order to grow sustainably. So I'm really pleased to introduce my friend, and in some ways one of my mentors. Leonard Wantchekon is a professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University. He's also at the faculty in economics as an associate, and he's a scholar with diverse interests. He has made substantive and methodological contributions to the fields of political economy, economic history, and development economics. He's also contributed significantly to the literatures on clientelism and state capture, resource curse, and democratization across Africa. His scholarship is shaped in part by his experiences as a left-wing, pro-democracy student activist under a repressive military regime in his native country of Benin from 1976 to 1987. So as you know, I just wanted to kind of segue into the fact that I'm from Togo, which is a neighboring country to Benin. So usually a lot of people look at Togo and Benin almost as the same country. So the military regime in his native country under Kerekou, the head of state, was very similar to what we had in Togo with General Eyadema in those same years. And so I'm Claude Grunitzky. I'm the founder of Trace and True Africa, which are 2 media companies championing the creativity of African youth. I'm a graduate of London University and MIT, where I got an MBA as a Sloan Fellow. And I'm really talking to you today because I'm launching True Africa around the belief that we need to find new and more actionable ways to nurture Africa's talent. This series that we started on March 4th, and again, it's a weekly series every Thursday at noon, and please spread the word on our series if you enjoy what you hear and what you see. This series is a partnership with the MIT Center for International Studies, CIS as we call it. I'm actually a research affiliate at CIS as well. And we aim to support and promote international research and education at MIT. We produce research that creatively addresses global issues, and we do this while helping to educate the next generation of global citizens. The website is cis.mit.edu if you want to learn more. Our other partner in this wonderful webinar series is MIT Africa. It's a program that's based at MIT CIS, and MIT Africa empowers MIT students and faculty to advance knowledge and solve the world's great challenges by connecting them with leading researchers, companies, and other partners in African countries. For more information, you can visit misti.mit.edu. Again, for those who came in late, who are not able to participate, or who want to share this information that we are disseminating through these webinars, you can go to trueafricauniversity.com, because True Africa University was created by Africans for Africa, and we aim to become a Pan-African learning community that is committed to accelerating Africa's sustainable development by mobilizing a global network of academic, industrial, and institutional partners. Now, again, Professor Leonard Wantchekon is very, very modest. He's also the founder of the African School of Economics in his home country. And he's also at the helm of other initiatives that are strictly just focused on development in Africa and what we call sustainable development in Africa. So it is with great pleasure that I now want to give the floor to Professor Leonard Wantchekon of Princeton University. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Claude, for such a generous introduction. So let me start by thanking MIT and thanking the organizers, particularly Claude, for inviting me. It was such a great pleasure. So I will be talking about leadership, and particularly enlightened leadership, and the role that knowledge and science play in promoting good and effective leadership in general, and in Africa in particular. So, all right, let me start by stating a very obvious fact, which is that when we talk about leadership in Africa, there is focus on the failures. And, for instance, Aseka in 2005 wrote that the story of leadership in Africa is a saddening tale of an African state in crisis, a state without sustainable leaders and culture, one in which the management of political transition and social policy is basically shamble. It's quite negative. Now, let's actually ask a very basic question. Is that actually true? Is it an accurate description of the situation in Africa? Not quite. I mean, like, for instance, you look at the GDP per capita from 1960 to 2019. You can talk about the lost decades from 70 to 80, perhaps up to even 90s, where the growth rate has been, the GDP per capita and growth rate had been very, very modest or sometimes negative. But, from 2000 to 2019, the GDP per capita of African countries has doubled. If you look at individual countries, like Kenya, Ghana, Benin, the GDP capital has actually doubled, and the half of the fastest growing economies around the world today are in Africa, Ghana, Kenya, and other places. So now, if you look at education, for instance, the data indicate that Africa has been shattering the expectation in terms of enrollment. Like, if you look at this graph, we are performing at a historical level in terms of access to education. Quality is a separate issue, but before quality, you need access. Now, more recently, if you look at governance of COVID-19, Africa has done quite well. Like, for instance, roughly 80,000 deaths. And there is a lot of focus on environmental factors and the youth, demographic factor. But in fact, when you look very closely, it's also driven in part by governance. Many countries have established task force at regional. There are task force at regional or national level. That has enabled, significant centralization and multidisciplinary sectoral engagement. AU and Africa CDC, for instance, has coordinated continental response, in particular in West Africa with ECOWAS. And prime minister and presidents have, set up task force that have ministries, technical experts, and governance policy that's very systematic and wide range, and also economic policy. Okay. Now, there are some success stories that's actually stunning. If you take a country like Mauritius, and nobody will doubt that the data from Mauritius is not accurate, because it's more or less a middle-income country. They have been very aggressive, like contact tracing, lockdown, public engagement of governments. And as you can see from the graph, there was a spike early on in April, and then it just died out, the rest of the year. So so it shows that, there is the story of leadership in Africa is a glass, half empty, half full. So now let me then get to the next question, which is, what makes a leader? The literature focus on drive, leadership, motivation, honesty, integrity, self-confidence, ability. But what I'm going to be focusing on the rest of the talk will be on knowledge and expertise. Okay, so and this is not something new. I mean, if you look at, for instance, the early post-independence leaders, they were, they check all the boxes in terms of, in terms of integrity, in terms of drive, determination. They're also highly, highly educated. For instance, Nkrumah is known as an ideologue, but also he was a writer and he was a political scientist. Nnamdi Azikiwe, for instance, was one of the, was in the 30s, was a doctoral student at Columbia and a master's student from UPenn, and Leopold Sedar Senghor was a member of, the French Academy. So leadership early on was enlightened, knowledgeable, and even though it can be clouded by ideology. So if you look at the Cold War leaders, for instance, they also, very, very influential. I don't have to present Nelson Mandela, obviously, but more recently, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who is now the WTO director and the former president of Liberia, are highly educated. They are all, connected to MIT and Harvard. So there's no question, for instance, that there has always been a correlation between leadership or leadership qualities and expertise. So now, in light of this, in light of the fact that leadership in Africa yesterday and today is in part driven by expertise, what are the paths forward? What are the paths forward? One point that I would like to make is that by and large, when we want to identify leaders today, we focus on activism and social entrepreneurship. There are leaders in the business sector, in the NGO sector, and so on. And I agree that those are important breeding ground for future leadership at national level. But I think we need to more and more focus on the fact that leadership expertise is critical. Leadership has to be grounded in in-depth knowledge of the environment, of the society that you are going to lead. Now, the second point that I would like to also stress, and we can talk about that during the discussion, is the role of institutions, because leaders and leadership is not something that just falls from the sky. Leaders and leaderships are something shaped by institutions. You need political parties, for instance, that have clear policy agenda, programmatic. You need accountability mechanism in place, that make the would-be leaders compete for leadership. And during the process of this competition, for instance, there will be a selection of the best, And I remember a quote by Kant in late 17th century, talking about the fact that you can even turn like devils. You can get devils to do something good for the society so long as the institutions are in place. So leadership is not driven by intrinsic personal quality, it's driven by the set of institutions that provide incentives for would-be leaders to behave well. So on that point, especially on institutions, I think there have been progress. In Africa, there is still, at least there is a sense in which, democracy is valuable. And when, for instance, there is backsliding on democratic institutions, people basically denounce it and try to get the country back to democratic norms. But there is still the case that we do not have a clear and good understanding of the role of expertise. But recently there is a trend in education that, talking about, research not being that important, that you need universities to train young people for jobs and to reduce unemployment, that advanced and foundational or cutting edge research is more or less like a luxury. This is very, very far from the truth, and this is actually dangerous, because we cannot outsource an understanding of who we are and where we come from. And this is very, very, very critical for a leader to emerge in an environment where people have clear understanding of who they are and where they come from. So, and the other, I came across this interesting quote by the former governor of Cross River State in Nigeria, which I think is very provocative and very interesting. He said that Nigeria is like an aircraft that's being flown by pilots that did not go to flying school. And he added by saying that when the plane crashes, everyone blames the pilot. The question, therefore, is where are African leadership flying school? How and where do Africans acquire the sophistication and leadership skills required to guide the continent into development? And I think this is very interesting because it shows that we need like high-end policy school, where leaders are trained by the same standard, for instance, that we see in Europe and the US, like law school, the public policy school here. But we also need universities. We need universities where people are highly committed to developing and doing knowledge at the highest level. And this is what is missing. So it's not a coincidence that, for instance, the decline of universities in Africa can be coupled to some degree to the decline in leadership quality. I'm saying that what sustains leadership in Africa is perhaps more the institutions than the expertise base needs for effective leadership. Now, I can finish by talking about something that I'm doing myself to deal with the issue is that beside the African School of Economics that I set up and that Claude has talked about, I recently set up basically an academy or an association of African scientists called the PanAfrican Scientific Research Council. And the goal is to highlight excellence in research on the continent, promote career development of young scholars, encourage multidisciplinary collaboration, encourage evidence-based policymaking, and also disseminate knowledge through public engagement. So, you can, if you go to the website of the council, you'll realize how important, how effective this is. So we have now more than 500 members. We have some of the top mathematicians and environmental scientists, biomedical scientists, economists, and so on. And we are going to have a journal. We are still deciding the name of the journal, but the editorial board is in place. We have career development to help sort of young people, to push young people to the frontier. And also another thing that we are also doing, have a research committee that will trailblaze areas where we need investigation, we need investment in fundamental research, but more importantly is public engagement. So, for instance, we would like to work with governments, with NGOs, with private sector, to be able to bring some of the cutting edge knowledge that had been developed to the continent. And I was very surprised myself to see how many Africans today are at very, very high places. You know, I mean, like, for instance, until recently, there was a colleague from Niger who was a professor in physics at MIT. I think he's now at Caltech. We have colleagues at Berkeley, you know, and at Harvard, and many, many, you know, top universities in the US. What we need is to federate, you know, our effort and to connect with the scientists on the African continent. And then besides that, you know, to find a channel through which we can actually engage effectively with policymakers, you know. So we absolutely need to create and to amplify the voice of African scientists. We need to bring expertise, scientific expertise, to policy making at the highest level, and that will be our contribution to leadership. So basically, you know, to summarize, so the point I wanted to make here is that we're in one area where that's very much good news for leadership development in Africa is institutions. You know, I mean, there are failed institutions across Africa, but, you know, again, at least there is a sense of the type of institution that are needed, that good progress. One thing which is, you know, also what is missing, you know, I think it's the way in which, another point, which another important element is social entrepreneurship. You know, I mean, like all across Africa, private sector, public sector, you have young people being fully engaged in dealing with specific crises, specific issues. And so that's fantastic. But then I think the point that is a bit missing that we need to resolve is education, is research, is innovation at all levels. And I think this will come not only from governments, not coming from international organizations, but it also comes from the scientists, the existing scientists themselves. You know, and this is what the issue that I try my best personally with other colleagues, to deal with. And I think that the initiative of True Africa University goes very much in this direction as well. And anyway, so but again, by doing all this, I insist on the fact that we are actually continuing the legacy of early African leaders who were highly, highly educated. You know, I mean, I talk about Nandi Azikiwe, talk about Kwame Nkrumah and Senghor, and currently, Nelson Mandela and Ngozi, who is the WTO director, and others. But I should also maybe stress, like, even those who were like hardcore revolutionaries, like Samora Machel from Mozambique, or Augusto Neto from Angola, and Amilcar Cabral from Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau. Particularly the last two were highly, highly educated. Augusto Neto was a poet, and Amilcar Cabral was a scientist. Even when he was running guerrilla, he was actually thinking about agricultural technology. So it shows that we need absolutely to take education in Africa to a new level if we want to promote development, and also if you want to promote effective leadership. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Leonard. There's so much that we will talk about. I want to start perhaps with my own childhood. I was born in the 1970s in Lomé, not too far from you in Benin, and that was a spirit of still post-independence exuberance and optimism. My family, they were all obsessed with African development, post-independence. And as you mentioned, these first leaders Many of them were highly educated, and they were idealistic, certainly, but they also had a certain level of expertise. My own country, Togo, our first president was Sylvanus Olympio, who was a graduate of the London School of Economics, and he'd been a successful um, executive in an important company. And then you also mentioned people like Amical Cabral, who was actually an agronomist, right? And we can even go into Angola, right? Agostinho Neto, when he took power in 1975, you're the one who reminded me that he actually was also a poet. You mentioned Senghor in Senegal, who was also a poet. So you had these really amazing minds who led the post-independence struggle in Africa. And then all of a sudden in 1970s, things started going wrong. And so I guess my question to you, Leonard, is what went wrong? Why is it that, how did we have gone, from these highly ambitious, idealistic, educated experts to these military dictators who pretty much destroyed the countries in which in which they were leading?
Yeah, so that's a great question. But I think, in the literature, in political science literature, people tend to focus on, ethnic diversity and lack of institutional maturity and so on. So they tend to focus on internal factors. But in fact, those changes were driven in large part by external factors, because many of the leaders that came out post 1960 were leftists, and they were more or less affiliated with the former Soviet Union. So the Cold War, played an important role, and also when it's not the Cold War, you have a very neo-colonialist mentality, that a leader that shows a little bit of independence from the metropole is immediately considered to be dangerous, because potential affiliate of the former Soviet Union, and has to be deposed. If you read the memoir of many of many of advisors of Charles de Gaulle in France and so on. This is the story, So and I think this is one of the reasons, and perhaps another reason is also the fact that the institutions that were set up were not democratic enough to build strong consensus around the leader. If you take Kenya, you take Tanzania, you take Ghana, driven by the leftist ideology, they have the mindset of the one-party state, which doesn't go very well, So, and I think it's a combination of a failure of a leftist ideology of one-party state, but also, the Cold War, where, anyone who dissents a little bit from the metropole is considered dangerous and has to be killed or actually deposed. So I think that's what I see to be the main reason. But and you can see that this led to negative growth in many countries for decades before the end of the Cold War and the renaissance of democracy in Africa, that much later have coincided with, had led to some kind of, an impressive growth, in many countries. We should never, downplay the fact that, GDP per capita in many countries in 20 years has doubled. So when we talk about, everything is shambles, leadership, we have to recognize that things have worked out to some degree, after the last decade. Yeah.
Well, then before we even get to the last decade, can we go back to the Colonial Project? Because I think when you and I were talking, there was something about the Colonial Project and their approach to leadership, which might explain a lot of the things that happened. The Colonial Project, was very much about training cooks, training people who would work, as domestic servants and so on. and not necessarily about training the next generation of leaders.
Exactly.
So can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I feel
Yes.
like not many people understand
Yes.
where we started in 1960 for those of us who became
Yes.
independent in 1960.
Yes. 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 I think that's a great point. I mean, for instance, we tend to forget that the fight that many nationalist leaders were involved in was not just for political independence. They were fighting for universities to be created. You know, I mean, they were writing by, former president of Nigeria, Nnamdi Azikiwe, that was basically talking about the fact that we should be educated like anyone. You know, we shouldn't be relegated to second class and so on. And by just getting us to learn how to cook, or learning to read and write, we need to be at the frontier of knowledge. And it's fitting that the first, or perhaps one of the first, that the University of Nigeria in Nsukka, for instance, bear his name. And I read the story, for instance, the first PhD from the former Republic of Congo, he graduated only after independence, and in fact, he has to be smuggled to Belgium to get his degree. I mean, he went to Belgium to study theology, because if he wanted to study something else, he would not have been able to go. So a Jesuit priest was actually pretend that he was going there to study theology. Theology is great, but you need to get people to study what they want to study. Anyway, so it shows that very explicitly, the Colonial Project was anti-intellectual as far as African goes. I mean, there's another example. I heard that the University of Dakar, for instance, early on, was mostly open to French people coming from a metropole, not to local students. So it was anyway. Now I think it's very important to remind ourselves this, because today, when people are talking about, in Africa, we all need to focus on primary education, we all need to do vocational training. Well, we are basically repeating the same, argument or discourse that the colonial administration was making in the 30s and 40s. So it's very, very important that we understand that education, it has to be at all levels simultaneously. You cannot move up undergrad and secondary if you don't have cutting edge, higher education. And investment has to be balanced. You have to balance the primary investment in primary, in secondary, but also in higher education. Because this is very, very critical. This is very critical. As I said earlier, you cannot import or outsource the deep and dungeon knowledge that you need to push your country forward. Yeah.
So we went from that to the pilots who didn't go to flying school, as Governor Duke of Nigeria said. So that's what happened. But then I want to push back a little bit about this model that education is so central to leadership. If we look at, say, Liberia, for instance, and you had a picture of former President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who actually served, I think, 2 terms as head of state in Liberia. If you actually study the growth of Liberia during those years, it wasn't that stunning, right? And her successor, George Weah, kind of revealed a lot of things related to corruption, and a lot of the same old things that were happening even before she took over as a Harvard-educated media star, right? So can we push back a little bit on the correlation between education and leadership for those African states?
Yeah. So no, I think that's a great point. So I'm not trying to be elitist here by saying that, you just need a degree from a fancy place to be able to be a good leader. No, I'm talking about education more broadly, expertise more broadly, and also, I'm also talking about institutions you can put in place to support, decision making in government. You know, sometimes you don't have, the leader doesn't have all the knowledge, but so long as he or she has the inclination to adopt and to be open to science, to be open to knowledge, and to open to expertise, I think is great. And also, I'm not saying that unless you have highly educated leader, nothing is possible. You know, I'm stressing, you know, knowledge and expertise as a major contributing factor. And, you know, and I think if you look on average, you know, on average, a slightly more educated leader or a leader that allow, you know, expertise, technical expertise to come into play in decision-making, policy decision-making, is going to be better than otherwise, you know. So I agree with you that I want to make education of a leader or leaders the only factor in deciding the quality of leadership and governance. It's an important contributing factor. But again, you know, I mean, leaders are made by the environment where they are, you know. So if it is an environment, for instance, where, you know, the average citizen is highly educated, very knowledgeable, they will be able to make the leader more knowledgeable as well, because the leader will be forced to listen to them, you know, to take into consideration what they want. Anyway, so no, I agree with you entirely, but I think knowledge has to go together with the quality of institutions, and for leadership to be actually effective, you know.
Right.
The danger we have today is the fact that people are dismissing expertise and knowledge very quickly, not only in leadership, but also in the society as a whole. You know, you can say, oh, I studied for 20 years and yet I'm unemployed, therefore education is irrelevant. You know, no, not that fast, you know. Anyway, thank you. Yeah. So that's...
Yeah. There was a, you know, I said earlier that I see myself as a moderator in a panel discussion. And so it's you and I, and then there's the other panelists, and who are the ones in the Q&A section. And there's a few really, really interesting questions, and I'm just going to get to a few of them. The first one is from Tim Weichsel, and he says, your work with scientists through the Pan-African Scientific Research Council seems very impressive. However, the sciences that you seem to have focused on are the well-established big sciences like physics, the medical profession, etc. So I feel like you know, Tim sees you know, your project as perhaps a little bit incomplete. Is there a way to kind of talk about that would make sense to us right now?
Oh, that's a fantastic point. So one of the things that we would like to do, and my university is highly supportive of that, is setting up innovation hubs. You know, an innovation hub will be more democratic in a sense, you know, than people with ideas, with solution to problem, for instance, will be given the opportunity to develop their ideas and make it effective and scale it up and so on. So one way to compensate for the more kind of high level theoretical research that we are currently covering is setting up innovation hubs, you know, not only in the US, because, you know, the project will be partly based in the US, but also across Africa, at least in 2 or 3 key regions, you know, where we can encourage like students, encourage young faculty, we can encourage anyone with an idea to be able to develop the idea and scale it up, you know. So I think this will be a wonderful complement to this. But having said that, you know, be able to federate those amazing African scientists that you barely hear about, and get them to push the research to higher level, but also to be able to mentor and to support a community of innovators and scientists across Africa, I think that's the way to go, because, I mean, sometimes some of those innovation to be generalized, they need to be, turned into advanced research to understand the mechanism better, So it cannot be either or, it has to be complementary. And I agree that the first step is what we did, but we need to complete this with open up to innovation and innovation centers and encourage everyone to come up with solutions. And I have to stress that innovation here, it doesn't mean just science, biomedical, innovation or environmental or computer science. Innovation can also be in sociology, in in economics. I mean, for instance, one of the projects I'm currently working on is on institutional experimentation. Like, for instance, are there techniques you can put in place to make government more effective? And this will imply like experimenting some techniques, some institutions, and see how effective they are. And the way you measure effectiveness is not only through what the institution led to, but the intrinsic effect of that institution. Like, for instance, let's say we want to make a decision in a community about, let's say, about school budget. That decision can be dictated by the village chief. It can also be debated, discussed, and then the village chief make the final determination. Those are two sets of institutions. One which is more authoritarian, the other one which is more democratic. So you can ask yourself, regardless of the outcome, which one of the two is more effective? Which one of the two is going to lead people to feel some way to get them to make, to make the most of the budget that have been put in place? Those are things that can be tested. So it's really important to also think of innovation to be not just something about science and technology. It can also be about, social science. It can be about institutions. Anyway, so I entirely agree with the premise of the question, and it's something that we are going to correct. Yeah.
But Tim is actually going even further in this innovation work that you describe as related to the scientists, and he's wondering if you might even be interested in linking the scientists to the work that is being done in forestry, for instance, or soil science or agronomy. Not the big sciences that he mentioned earlier. Is that part of the project as well?
Yes, absolutely, and that's the part that Princeton is highly interested in. I mean, like, for instance, the Dean of Innovation, Vice Dean of Innovation here, it's all about startups. Like, you have an idea, turn into a startup, get it to the private sector, get it to the public sector, scale it up, test this, and so on. So linking entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship to research and science, it's something that shows huge promise, and it's something that we are embracing. You find something on solar energy in the lab and so on. It should be about how you turn into something which impacts lives directly. How do you get some startup to grow out of this idea? It's something, but it's not something for others to do. It's not like, as a researcher, you write a bunch of equations, you get some result, and you think that might work, and then leave to others, if you are lucky, to pick it up. The idea here is, like, actually during the whole process, you make sure that those who are going to take it and run with it, they are also part of it. And so that as soon as it's done, they pick it up and grow. It's a new concept of higher education and research. It's not that new, but I mean, it's something that being pushed very hard by some universities. I think Princeton is one of them. And I think it's very much in line with the comments.
Actually, Christopher Baker has a question about the stagnation that you and I described in the 1970s and 1980s. And he's wondering if that stagnation was the result of the Cold War, which kind of implied that the continuing success of economies in Africa going forward will depend on each economic bloc properly managing the external forces, as in managing the rivalry between Russia, China, US, Europe, and some of the external shocks, financial crises and pandemics. Now, it sounds like a complicated question, but I think in this post-pandemic world, we have to start asking ourselves these kinds of questions.
No, I mean, I think, no, this is a fantastic question. So what I can say is that we shouldn't go back to the Cold War. We shouldn't go back to a situation where we just depend on China or the former Soviet Union or the US or France and so on. We need to develop our own institutions. So that's why I salute, for instance, the recent development in African Union, like the trade agreement within Africa, and the agenda that the AU and regional organizations are put in place, so that we are not, it's not about playing one block against the other. It's about deciding what we want, and then seek support in a very neutral way. Now, to come back to the Cold War, it was really a war. Angola civil war, for instance, Ethiopian civil war, for instance, and the coup in Ghana and the civil war in Congo. This was brutal. It's not okay. So the reason why you have stagnation is also directly due to conflict, to bloodshed that were engineered more or less from abroad. So this is less the case today. So even if there is, we're still victim of competition between several blocks. It's less likely to be as destructive as it used to be, because I don't see China and US fomenting war between two domestic factions and stuff. I think we grew past that stage. If you are conspiracy theorists, you can think that this is still possible, blah, 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 but I think I'm slightly more optimistic than that. But anyway, so it has two things. So first, it was so bad because it was so conflictual. But now, the lesson we learn is that, let's do things on our own. Let's get together, think about what we want to do, develop trade between African countries, have Pan-African organizations, where scientists and, like leaders or, business people from South Africa, Morocco, and Mali, we get together, we coordinate. This is the world we need to be in. We shouldn't be trying to get instruction from abroad. So it was, anyway. To summarize, the Cold War was bad because it was really, really, really violent. But calling rivalry between blocks is still there. But then we have to make sure that we bypass this rivalry and coordinate among African countries and African citizens to get ownership of our future.
Yeah, this leads me to an interesting comment that came from S. Green, who kind of reminded us that post-independence conflict was a reality in many countries, and not just in Africa, but worldwide. And S. Green mentioned national wars in countries like India, Ireland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, which is I find really, really interesting. But now, going back to your comment about Nigeria, it gives me an opportunity to ask a question, that will really look at the Maghreb as Africa, right? Because sometimes people identify the Maghreb as the Middle East. They don't, they forget that the Maghreb is really fully Africa. And Kyle Marston is saying, do you have any comments on the Tunisian experience regarding institutional development? What are the lessons the sub-Saharan sphere can integrate from the Arab Springs success story there? So that's a question that I find interesting as well.
Yeah, no, I think, okay, let me put it this way. So I agree that this divide, North, Sub-Saharan, is there. And we need to work towards basically integrating the two regions. Like, for instance, and this cannot be just by government. It can also be by citizens, the communities. And, for instance, I think a sizable proportion of the members of the Pan-African Research Council are from like Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and Egypt. So now, okay, let me put it this way. In terms of the Arab Spring, it's very interesting because we have to, okay, Arab Spring in Tunisia, for instance, grew out of a very strong democratic culture, because I mean, some countries were socialist, because under Habib Bourguiba, it was socialist leaning, but very liberal and moderate, like for instance, he invested, I mean, his government invested very highly on women's education, something like that. So, but then it's not the same thing in Libya and Egypt, So, so that's one point I wanted to make, and there is so much to learn from, like countries that have a pre-existing strong democratic culture. When you have movement like Arab Spring, they make the most of it. But countries with pre-existing culture of violence, like Libya, and other places, they movement like Arab Spring can be even destructive. It's something I study in one of my papers on the nature of the nature of independent movement and institutions in the post-independent period. So now let's add, especially coming from Benin and being one of the actors of, of the pre-Arab Spring in Sub-Saharan Africa, to say that something similar to Arab Spring happened in Sub-Saharan Africa. Like there were student movement, there were uprising that are peaceful, that took place, that led to national conference in Benin, that led with transition to democracy. And many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa has their, I don't know what you call it, summer spring or summer, what am I saying? Summer uprising or whatever, I mean, anyway, what I'm saying is that Arab Spring is important, but there was something similar in Sub-Saharan Africa in the 90s, and again, we have to distinguish, between the Tunisian Arab Spring and the Libyan one, and driven in part by the pre-existing culture in the country.
Well, we have 2 minutes left in our talk. I wish we had more time, but we do ask a question, and I'm going to give you 1 minute to answer this question. It's the 3 books that you would recommend to our audience here, because they'd probably be interested, and if maybe you want to come back to it, but maybe just maybe 1 or 2 or 3 books that you could recommend. Well, I can recommend one of your books,
okay.
right? So, and I'll put it in the presentation.
Yeah. Okay. So now you put me on the spot here. So, that's tricky. So, okay, let me put it this way. I think to really understand the Cold War dynamics in a forceful way, I will recommend that the audience read Jacques Faucard Parle, which is a biography of one of the top advisors of
President Mitterrand and de Gaulle, and
De Gaulle, and also Mitterrand. I also one more will be Things Fall Apart, which is a fantastic, wonderful book by Chinua Achebe. So
it was recommended last week. Yeah. So this is a place for us to end. I want to remind you that next Thursday, same time, noon EST, we have a wonderful discussion with Touria El Glawi, who is the founder of 154 Art Fair. It's a contemporary art fair, and she's going to be talking about the market for contemporary art from Africa. Again, I want to thank our partners, MIT Africa and MIT Center for International Studies. This is True Africa University. You can go to trueafricanuniversity.com to watch the entire discussion we had today with Professor Leonard Wantchekon. Thank you so much for coming. And it was great, great, great to talk to you about these issues related to the future of our beloved African continent. Fantastic. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to you all. Bye.